So World War II occurs during the New Deal, right? We've been talking about the New Deal. So the question then is, what were the causes of the U.S. entry into World War II and the consequences that come out of the decision, especially on the American home front? And it's going to be a lot of this is tied in with that idea that we were in the Great Depression and there was a New Deal going on. But before we get there, let's take a look at the rise of fascism in Europe. So fascism has several traits, and the definition can get a little squirrely sometimes. But the idea of fascism is this. The examples are Germany and Italy. Obviously, Germany has the Nazis and Adolf Hitler, and Italy has Mussolini. But fascism has these traits of ultranationalism. Um, you know, think of it as like patriotism on steroids. That the country can never do anything wrong, and to question the country is to question um, all goodness in itself, right? So the country never does anything wrong, and the leaders of the country could never possibly do anything wrong because of that. It's based on militarism. And if you see down here, right, Hitler and his fascist Nazi party members always wore their military uniforms. It's based on being very pro-military to show strength and manliness. Fascism does require a fear of an other, though. It's basically a very weak system, right? For all their strength and manliness, they're terrified of some other coming and taking that power away. Now, this is a mental trick that they play on their followers, right? Give the party so much power because there's always somebody else over there that's going to harm you, that's going to take away your freedom, to take away your success. Fascism is also totalitarian in that it puts the needs of the state, meaning the needs of Germany, the needs of Italy, etc., over the needs of the individual. There's no freedom of speech. There's no freedom of the press. There's no freedom of religion. You do what the state tells you to do because that is what is necessary. You don't get any of that other stuff. Okay. And it is almost by definition a dictatorship, an authoritarian dictatorship. In this case, Hitler, and over here, this is Mussolini in Italy. So keep those traits of fascism in mind because as we go through the unit, we're going to refer back to them. Fascism grows in Italy first, but Germany is going to use that, and the Nazi Party uses fascism as a theory to help explain its loss and embarrassment as a result of World War I. Remember, after World War I, they were forced to sign that embarrassing and crippling Treaty of Versailles. They had to pay war reparations, had to take responsibility for the war. They had their military basically taken away. And they needed somebody to blame for that problem because if the Nazis are going to say that they are the good, pure, honest, best people in the world, how could they have lost the war? So the theory that they come up with is called the stabbed in the back myth, which is based on a history of anti-Semitism in Germany, going back hundreds of years. Anti-Semitism is this idea of a hatred of the Jewish people, and using that historical anti-Semitism, using their pretty misogynistic language and referring to Jewish people as almost feminine and weak. They were the ones that stabbed the good German soldiers in the back during World War I and caused them to lose. So while the men were out there fighting, the Jewish population was back home, undermining their efforts. So therefore, they needed to be taken care of. They needed to be eliminated from the decision-making process and eventually altogether eliminated because of that stab in the back myth and that history of anti-Semitism. I think it's important to note that Hitler doesn't create the Nazis. This is not some, German fascism is not some result of a single individual person that tricked the population into being fascist. And I think it's also important to note that the Nazis never actually were a majority of the country. They were never a majority party. That once they earned enough followers, they were able to bully and bludgeon the country to follow along with them. Hitler joined the Nazis in the early 1930s, so the Nazis already existed, and because there was already that history of anti-Semitism, because there was a fear and anger and embarrassment, that's one of the reasons the fascists were able to rise up through the political channels. So a relatively small group of right-wing extremists, and we can talk about left-wing and right-wing, but I mean, this is obviously a right-wing extremist action, attempted to overthrow a democratic government with a small armed insurrection. It's referred to as the Munich Beer Hall Putsch. In this Putsch, which is insurrection, word for insurrection, um, Hitler riled up some Nazis to go try to overthrow the Munich government, and then he called it a heroic effort to save the nation. Save the nation. So, kill off the Weimar Republic, which is a democracy, by implementing an armed insurrection to overthrow a capital. Hitler was found guilty of treason. He was sentenced to 5 years for treason, and he only served a few months of that. While he was in the prison, he wrote a book called Mein Kampf, which stands for My Struggle. And in that book, he talks about the weakness of the government, but also blames Jewish people for all of the problems in his life. Very little personal responsibility. Hitler realized that as a result of that, he couldn't force the revolution upon the people. He had to work his way through the elections, which is quite an irony, right? Because the Nazis are all about taking away people's freedoms. So he's going to use the democratic powers of freedom of speech and assembly in order to gain power, so that he could then take away people's freedom of speech and assembly. And that's the problem with fascism, right? Is when you're on the inside part of that group, everything seems great, but they're only a few weeks, if not months, if not years away from taking away your rights as well. So Germany was primed and ready for fascism. We see that in the Beer Hall Putsch. We can see that the Weimar Republic, which was the German democracy, was seen as a pretty weak democracy. And whether it was or not, it was viewed that way by the Germans because of the Treaty of Versailles, because of the embarrassment, because of the bad economy, all of that. And Hitler promised to rearm Germany, to begin expansion, to make people feel manly again. And then that would fix the economy. That was his basic argument. And Nazis never had a majority. They only got about 43% of the seats. In a parliamentary system, the party with the most seats in the Congress gets to pick who the leadership is. It's not like the American system. So the Nazis didn't even have a majority of the seats. So they had to form a coalition government with another party to get the majority. Hitler is then made chancellor. Just prior to this election, there was a Reichstag fire. The Reichstag is their congressional building. Hitler convinced the German president, at that point Hindenburg, to pass the Enabling Act, which would give, basically it gives the Nazis, who were the government at that point, the ability to enact any laws that it wants, any decrees. And they used that Enabling Act, plus a couple of other things, to strip people's civil liberties, eliminate pretty much all the opposition parties, and Hitler becomes essentially a dictator without calling himself quite yet. When Hindenburg dies a year or so later, a couple years later, he will be made into the Führer, or the dictator. By 1936, 3 years after the Enabling Act, the Rhineland is taken. It's this red area right here on the west coast, west of Germany. By 1938, Austria is brought in. Later in 1938, the British and leaders in Czechoslovakia meet with Hitler at Munich. They signed the Munich Agreement, whereas Munich is right here by Austria. Hitler had been threatening to try to invade Czechoslovakia. They got Hitler to promise that if they let him have part of Czechoslovakia, he wouldn't try to take all of Czechoslovakia. He made that promise, and then 6 months later, he immediately goes back on the deal. Appeasement tends not to work. You get dictators and authoritarians and fascists what they want. They tend to just ask for more. So Hitler used that time to build up his power base even more. The British thought that they had won peace in our times. That's what Neville Chamberlain said when he went back to England. And then that fell apart about 6 months later. So he gets part of Czechoslovakia. Then he invades Poland in 1939. Oh, there we go. And the Europeans lacked any will or moral strength to try to confront Hitler's aggression. Here he is, walking on the backs of the spineless leaders of democracy and blowing his nose at them. The Europeans were in the middle of the Great Depression still, and they did not think that they had the ability, the economy, or the desire really to worry about these other places. They assumed that Hitler would just kind of stop once he got what he wanted. The invasion of the Rhineland was 1936. So this is even before Hitler begins his expansion, and it is going to really take shape during that initial parts of the war. In 1935, Hitler begins creating what's going to amount to the Holocaust, created a racial-based state against the Jewish population. I know Jewish people, I know Judaism is a religion, but they didn't see Judaism as a religion as much as they did a race. And he's going to try to eliminate the Jewish population from the German population, right? So in 1935, the Nazis passed the Nuremberg Laws, which removed German citizenship from Jewish Germans. This removes any protection of the state and actually turns it so the state is now going to oppress the Jewish people. Similar to the way we talked about Jim Crow laws being a target towards the black population and Asian people out on the West Coast. The first ghettos and concentration camps are started in the mid-1930s. Other laws are passed that refine what it means to be German and to be Jewish. For example, in 1938, the Nazis passed the name law, which altered passports to make it harder for Jewish people to leave the country. And then in 1938, we get the first example of a state-sponsored attack on Jewish people and businesses. Why does this matter? Because it is literally the Nazi government that allowed and really set into motion the attack on Jewish people. So now the government itself is out there attacking the Jewish population. And you can see here, these are Jewish businesses that were destroyed. And the most frightening part of the picture I see is right here. These two people are walking past this night of broken glass, right? And they're just smiling and laughing and having a nice day. The only thing it takes for evil to win is good people to do nothing. And this is good people, perhaps, doing nothing. 3 days after Kristallnacht, all Jewish businesses are closed. By January of 1939, Hitler declared war. He declares that war would be the end of the European Jewish population. Before he invades Poland, he's already saying if the Germans were to go to war, he is going to murder all the Jewish people. Some Jewish people see that, and in January, February, March, April, May of 1939, about 900 Jewish people board a cruise ship called the St. Louis. They try to go to North America. They try to go to the United States. They're denied. They try to go to Cuba. They're denied. Finally, the only place they're allowed to come back to is various European countries. And of the 900 or so, I believe 260 or 70 are going to be killed in concentration camps. By September of 1939, Poland is invaded. World War II has begun. And within the year, Auschwitz, which is the one of the worst of the death camps, was created. And what's the American response to all of this? Isolation. The initial reaction of the Americans was to isolate themselves. They didn't want to get involved in another European war. Now, this gives the Americans an advantage that it's going to be 2 years before they go to war. And it's just like World War I, they're going to come into the war relatively late and relatively fresh. Congress initially reacted to the outbreak of war by passing the Neutrality Acts, trying to enforce neutrality on America, to try to prevent them being drawn into the war. They remembered the causes of World War I, the sinking of the Lusitania, the huge amounts of debt to the Allies. And they tried to pass laws that would prevent them from falling into those traps again. So to make sure that there's no Lusitania moment, Americans couldn't travel on board any ships that were at war, and they couldn't trade with them. They couldn't give out loans to nations at war, right? So no business was allowed to give up money that would then lead to debt that had to be paid back, trying to keep Americans from being pulled into the war. Because as this cartoon shows, right, stay out of the war for my sake as well as your own. And this is democracy, America, the last refuge of democracy. The United States was afraid of entering into another European war. That all kind of changes with this. Hitler invades France. France fell within 6 weeks. The European border is now, I'm sorry, Europe is mostly controlled by uh, the Nazis by the end of 1942. But in 1940, the Nazis control pretty much the entire top of the border up here by the English Channel, and that's going to lead to the Battle of Britain. Now, the Battle of Britain was not an actual like physical land attack; it's the term that we use for the crossing of the English Channel by the German Luftwaffe, the Air Force, and dropping bombs on all these major European, British, dropping bombs on all the British cities. This takes place for about 6 months throughout the summer of 1940. At this 6 month aerial bombardment, the Germans were trying to soften up the British so that they could then invade across the English Channel. It fails. This is where we get that famous, you can see the meme picture over here, right? The keep calm and carry on. The British just kept going, and they had these wonderful little things that happen. They developed radar technology. You can see the little radar towers along the border. And then they have this wonderful misinformation campaign. They said that they were feeding their pilots carrots so that they could see in the dark, because a lot of these bombing missions happen in the dark. And they did that because with the radar, you could see where the planes were. So the British were really good at shooting down German planes at night. And they said it's because of the carrots, but it's really because of radar. Fantastic propaganda misinformation campaign. They had blackouts so that it made it harder for they basically, no light was allowed in the cities after dark, made it harder for the Germans to find their cities. The Germans failed, right? And they then decided to turn around and start facing the Soviet Union. But before we get there, the Nazi aggression and the fact that they beat the French so quickly, and then now the only thing standing between the Nazis and America is Britain, they started revising the Neutrality Acts. America passed the Cash and Carry Act in 1939, which allowed the Allies to come to the United States to buy American goods with cash, no credit, didn't want that debt. They had to take it back to Europe on their own ships, right? No Americans killed by the German subs, but they're now trying to help the Allies. You can see here there's a campaign to aid Britain. Let Britain be the shield for the United States, right? The committee to defend America by aiding the Allies. The United States even starts creating a peacetime draft. They're getting ready because they see a war happening. They're worried about the Nazi aggression. Roosevelt, who's the president, said that the United States needed to become the arsenal of democracy. The United States doesn't want to send sons over there to die, but the United States should use its industrial capacity to support the Allies, provide them with war materials. For example, the destroyers for bases deal. The United States would get gave up like 50 old destroyers, military ships, to the British because theirs were getting sunk so quickly. In exchange, the British give the United States bases, but the United States is giving away an arsenal to the British to keep the war over there so we don't have to worry about it over here. This actually was not as widespreadly accepted as you'd think. There is a savage debate about the amount of effort the United States should put into this war. On one side of the debate are the isolationists. There's more than a little bit of anti-Semitism there as well. For example, this is the America First campaign, right? The America First campaign was isolationist, didn't want to get involved with the war. This is the German-American Bund rally. You can see here, this is that's George Washington in the middle there. You can see the Betsy Ross flags, right? But this was a fascist rally that was held in Madison Square Garden in New York City in 1939. So even up until the moment of, we're getting into the war, some Americans were really supportive of the idea of fascism, thought that Hitler had the right idea. Be nationalist, have a strong military, all that stuff. One guy that was a big supporter was Charles Lindbergh, the guy who flew across the ocean. He was a celebrity Think like a Kardashian, right? Very famous for flying across the ocean, brave pilot, all that stuff. He was an American first advocate, one of the leaders of that movement. He's got a little bit of anti-Semitism there as well. Continuing on with this move from isolation to intervention, getting part of the war. We had the Neutrality Acts, that gives way to cash and carry, then destroys for bases. And now the last part is the Lend-Lease Act, or as you can see here, all age short of war. And it was, again, still controversial. We're going to give weapons and materials away this time. Instead of loaning, right, and expecting that to get back, the United States is not going to sell these weapons. The United States is going to give away these weapons. By the end of the war, the United States gives away about $200 billion worth of stuff. And they only spent $40 billion on the entire New Deal. So this is a big deal. That is a massive amount of government spending. And that government spending stimulated the economy, which ends the Great Depression. It has nothing to do with the war. It's about the massive amount of deficit spending, which is what Roosevelt had been screaming about during the New Deal. Spend money to prime the pump and get the country out of the Depression. But when it was building things like schools and bridges and dams, it was considered government waste. But, building tanks and guns and bombs and stuff that, kills people, that's fine. It stimulates the economy and ends the war, and you can see that here. This is an unemployment chart. The war starts in 1939 with unemployment way up here. And then by 1942, which is when the United States is almost ready to get into the war, you can see unemployment has dropped. They've become an arsenal for democracy. The defense production is through the roof, and workers are joining the workforce, especially after the war, especially after the United States gets in the war, and the white men go off and fight the war, and then there's opportunities for women and minorities. Okay, that was a lot. The Battle of Britain is a failure. Hitler needs a victory. He focuses away from England and he turns his sights on the Soviet Union. They had actually been allies. The Soviet Union and the Nazi Germans had invaded Poland together and split it in half. But after the Battle of Britain, Germany invades the Soviet Union. The United States' immediate reaction is not the Soviet Union got what they deserved. Nope. The United States gives Lend-Lease money to the Soviet Union so that the war can be fought over there. In the end, the Soviet Union is going to face 24 million deaths. Million deaths. They're going to call it the Great Patriotic War. At that point, the United States sees that it needs to start preparing. War is on the way. And this is Churchill right here, and here is Roosevelt over here. They signed an agreement on the Atlantic Ocean. You can see they're on a boat called the Atlantic Charter. The United States is essentially in an unofficial war at this point. Hitler's not a dummy, so he starts attacking American ships and gets the Japanese to start planning an attack on Pearl Harbor. The Japanese, the Germans, and the Italians had created the Tripartite Pact earlier that year. And the Japanese in general have been expansionists. They were brutal occupiers. They had taken over parts of China and just raped and murdered everybody in cities. For example, the rape of Nanking. The United States had embargoed trade with Japan, which means the United States was not giving them the steel and the oil that they wanted for their fleets. In turn, that made Japan mad. They had actually sent people to the United States to try to negotiate an end to the embargo. And while they were doing that, they were also planning the attack on Pearl Harbor. On December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor is attacked by the Japanese. The Japanese had been allies with the Axis. That destroys any sense of isolationism, right? This is Dr. Seuss here. Isolationism, war, never knew what hit him. Isolationism is gone. The United States declares war on Japan. Japan declares war on the United States. Then the Allied powers and the Axis powers are all set, right? The United States declares war on Germany as well. Part of the Atlantic Charter up here was that the United States would attack in Europe first and then just hold off in Japan. And then we get kind of this really interesting thing where the United States sets up a war production board. Okay, the War Production Board was a direct command economy. The United States government told people what to produce, how to produce, and how much to produce. And I really don't like this, but the district is suggesting that you know this. This is a continuation of New Deal command economy policy. The New Deal wasn't command economy. The government was buying things, paying for things, hiring people, but that's not a command economy. A command economy takes away all private industry. There was private industry due to the New Deal. This was an extension of that. This is a step beyond that, right? It's not a continuation, it's an advancement of a command economy. The New Deal wasn't a command economy, but just remember this because this is going to be on the test. How are they paying for all of this stuff? Well, they're financing it with deficit spending. Deficit spending. They're borrowing money from Americans through war bonds. War bonds are they sold these war bonds with the promise they'll pay them back later. It's a loan. It's a deficit spending. That deficit spending is going into the economy, kicks the economy into high gear, ends the Great Depression, and production goes up. Kick them on their axis, right? How are you going to do that? Keep building stuff, right? The government was worried that it might lead to inflation. So they said, nope, we're just not going to have inflation. They set prices. They said there might be price gouging. Nope, no price gouging. They just set prices. Maybe they were worried that workers, knowing that the economy, that the government was desperate for stuff, might go on strike. Nope, no strikes. There's wage controls. So the government was in charge of the economy at this point. That is much different than what was happening in the New Deal. A lot of propaganda is emerging here, encouraging civilians to shift valuable resources from civilian to military use. There's rationing. In all, there's a lot of sacrifices necessary. People were sacrificing the war, rationing. They grew victory gardens. Women were taking on traditionally male jobs. They're buying war bonds with the money that they do have. Like this is a scrap metal drive, right? You see this scrap metal right here? Scrap metal that could be melted down and made into tanks and guns and bombs. And then they're squishing Adolf Hitler here with that weight of their scrap metal drive. The idea was everybody should be sacrificing to help America win the war. Women join not only workforce, but also the Army. There's the Women's Army Corps in the Army, and then the Volunteer Emergency Services, or the WAVES in the Navy. Rosie the Riveter right here, we can do it, right above my head, was telling people that everybody is going to need to participate. And there was going to be sacrifice from all Americans. And then you get propaganda like this, right? American Revolution, there's a woman. World War II, there's women. It's a tradition. Women have always contributed to wartime defense throughout American history. It's a little more complicated for African Americans, of course. There's a certain irony to fighting the evil racist Nazi Adolf Hitler with a segregated army. This did not go unnoticed by African Americans. So during the war, the question was, how much should African Americans help out? The answer came in the form of the Double Victory campaign. Within the African American community, there was a real discussion through newspapers and through just oral conversations what to do. And they came up with this idea of a double victory. They would join the army. Many of them decided this. They would join the army, fight in that segregated military, go over there, fight the war, and win the war against the evil racists abroad. But then they were going to come back home, and they were going to have a double victory because they're also going to fight and defeat evil racist Jim Crow here in the United States. For his part, here's Franklin Roosevelt, right? Roosevelt signing Executive Order 8802. And there's Lincoln, which should tell us a little something. There had been historically racial discrimination in the defense industry. African Americans wanted jobs. They threatened a march on Washington if there was still going to be racial discrimination against African Americans. A. Philip Randolph is going to threaten that march on Washington. He'll bring it back later during the Civil Rights era. And then Executive Order 8802 ended discrimination in the defense industry, which leads to further migration of African Americans in the North, that continuation of the Great Migration that we saw earlier. Part of the Double Victory campaign, African Americans do join the military. You can see here the Tuskegee Airmen. Problem again, still segregated military. Mexican Americans are also going to face discrimination. There was a program called the Bracero program. All of those Okies from the Midwest that had moved to California were migrant laborers. They all decided to join the military, so they needed somebody to pick the fruits and vegetables. And in the Bracero program, Mexicans, not Mexican Americans, but Mexicans literally were invited to cross the border to come in and perform those jobs. As a result, Hispanic population in the Southwest grew. This caused a lot of racial tensions, and we can see that racial tension really solidifying with the Zoot Suit riots, which is where a bunch of white sailors who were in San Diego decided to go beat up Mexicans who were wearing Zoot Suits, which was kind of a party outfit. Completely a racially motivated attack, but if you can see here, it's not the white sailors that were being arrested. They had to go back and fight. Is the Zoot Suiters. So, and then finally, you see here, Native American, in this case a Navajo. They had such a complicated language system that the military used them as code talkers. So they could just go on and talk on the radio, and the Germans couldn't break the language barrier. And they were able to communicate back and forth. In the end, even not just Navajo, but about a third of all eligible Native Americans served in the war because their economic problems were so bad. Remember, all the way back to the stuff we talked about in Unit 3 with the decline of the Native populations. So in the end, there's a lot of opportunities created for these quote-unquote marginalized groups, non-white groups. Women were both working, and they were in the Army Corps and the Navy Corps, the Tuskegee Airmen, the Code Talkers, even the 442nd Japanese, which we'll talk about next time. That's these guys right here. They had captured a Nazi outpost. They were one of the most decorated units in World War II, and it was a Japanese-American infantry regiment. We're going to stop there, and we'll pick up with the rest of World War II later.